For the first part of this, we're going to review some of the basics of how behavior works. For the second part of this course, we'll get more into detail in terms of how behavior then applies to PBIS in the district. So to begin, we're going to look at the concept of antecedent behavior and consequence as it applies to the whole behavioral sequence. It's been in my experience that every behavior follows this pattern, starting with antecedent, moving to the behavior, moving then to a consequence. I'll cover each of these areas. It's important to know that they always flow from antecedent behavior to consequence. And as we go through, I'll clarify what each of those stands for. We will also cover the function or a possible function of the student's behavior, or what is the purpose of the student's behavior. So first, let's take a look at antecedent. An antecedent is a stimulus that precedes or accompanies a behavior and may exert discriminative control over that behavior. Basically, what that means is that the antecedent sets the occasion for the behavior to occur. It does not cause the behavior, and that's important to remember. It sets the occasion for the behavior to occur. Some examples of an antecedent might be a request to do work, might be placing food in front of the student, might be a promising extra time at recess, dirty looks, hopefully not pinching, closing the classroom door, looking at a student, cold breeze, bright light. And the reason why there are several things on there is to illustrate that many things might set the occasion for a behavior to occur. It's important to remember that they are not the cause of the behavior. However, when we work to change some behaviors, we may modify some of the antecedents or some of the occasions that we set. And this will become particularly important when we talk about our PBIS work, because a lot of it is based on changing how we set the occasion for certain behavioral sequences to occur. Behavior itself seems simple, but it's important whenever we do planning that it meet a few solid rules. But a behavior itself is just any action of an individual that operates on the environment, changing it in some way. For the purpose of functional assessment, the behavior has to be both observable and measurable. And so when we do any behavioral planning or work on behavior with students, we have to be sure that we can both observe the behavior. So a good rule for that is, will a stranger know exactly what to look for when you tell him or her the target behavior you're planning to modify? We have to be able to also measure it, meaning that can you count the number of times that it occurs, for example, in a 15-minute period, a 1-hour period, or 1 day, or can you count the number of minutes that it takes for a child to perform the behavior? And the reason for that is we can't modify things that we can't either see or observe or measure, meaning we can't modify thoughts. We can modify behaviors that are connected to thoughts, but we have to be able to observe and measure behaviors that we attempt to modify. And then the last in the sequence that we'll cover is the whole concept of consequence. Most people, when they hear the term consequence, they think of punishment. But a consequence is actually, and I don't think you can read the top line, but it's an event that occurs following a behavior. A consequence can act as either a reinforcer or a punisher, and this is important to know. Whether a consequence is a reinforcer or a punisher is dependent on its effect on the behavior and not our perception of it. And I'm going to give you some examples of that here in a second, but I want to talk through that first. Basically, there are times where our behavioral sequences try to govern what we perceive as things that might be reinforcing or might encourage a behavior, or punishing or might discourage a behavior. In reality, when we work with students, their behavioral sequence, their antecedent behavior consequence sequence, may be different than ours. They may have been conditioned to respond to different reinforcers and different punishers. So when we do, particularly when we do more detailed or in-depth behavioral planning with students, we have to basically look at the proof is in the pudding, meaning that we have to look at the result of our actions to really know if it's a punisher or a reinforcer. If it's a reinforcer, it means that it increases the frequency of the behavior that it follows or strengthens the behavior. Some examples of that might be candy, praise, a smile, pat on the back, a frown, a detention or suspension. I'm going to explain why those last three are there. And then if it's a punisher, it's an event that will decrease the frequency of the behavior it follows or weaken the behavior. And some examples of that might be candy, praise, smile, pat on the back, frown, detention, and suspension. And I'll explain why they're identical, those lists. Because again, some of the students we work with, their behavioral sequences may be very different than ours. So they may respond to very different reinforcers or punishers than we do. Now I want to address the whole idea of detention and suspension being a reinforcer. It's a little more in depth in this training, but I'm going to throw out the concept of a negative reinforcer and a positive reinforcer. Negative reinforcement still increases the likelihood of a behavior that it follows, but it means the negative refers to the removal of something. So when you hear the term negative and positive reinforcer, don't think good or bad. Think negative as removal, positive as applying something. Negative reinforcement works basically if you were to use a suspension on a student that's engaging in work refusal. If you allow them, by suspending them, to not have to come to school for 2 or 3 days, you may actually, instead of the intent which is to punish that behavior and get them to stop that, you may actually be reinforcing that by removing the expectation to do work. They're removing the expectation to be in school. And that's a negative reinforcer. Remember, negative doesn't mean bad, it means removal of something. Positive reinforcer is something we might think of like praise as a positive reinforcer, meaning that we want a student to do a certain behavior more, raise their hand, stay in their seat, complete their work. We may provide praise for that, verbal reinforcement, verbal praise, or a pat on the back or a smile. That's probably more characterized as a positive reinforcer, meaning not a good, meaning the application of something. However, you may notice that those things are also over in the punisher list. There are some students' behavioral sequences, ABC sequences, that would cause them to respond opposite to what we might expect in terms of behavior if you apply that. The next concept we'll look at then is the whole concept of function within this ABC sequence. Remember, we talked about antecedents, the things that set the occasion for the behavior. We have the behavior itself that we can observe and measure, and then a consequence, either a reinforcer or a punisher, that comes after the behavior and either strengthens or weakens it. Within that concept is something called function, and the function of the behavior for a student is really the sort of the purpose of their behavior, and there are 4 main functions. One is positive reinforcement in terms of getting attention. One is positive reinforcement to gain materials, or sometimes not just materials, but items to get to go to a place they want to go, get to do something at a certain time, all fit under there. Another one is negative reinforcement, or escape from task demands. And then the last one is automatic reinforcement, or sensory needs. We see this often with our students that are on the autism spectrum or have other sensory needs, where they'll do things for that function. Positive reinforcement is a student that may get a lot of attention either from adults or students for their behaviors, for attention. And positive reinforcement for materials is, like I explained, a student that may really desire something or something to happen at a certain time. And negative reinforcement is fairly common in terms of work refusal, trying to get out of task demands. One of the things I encounter with negative reinforcement is very early on students will get into that pattern and sometimes be reinforced by that by having us allow them to get out of work expectation. And it's very important that we stop the pattern of negative reinforcement for escaping task demands very early in a student's career, because that is a very hard one to compete with as they get older. So it's important to know, I want to go back and review quick the whole concept of ABC and function. So, because we're almost done with this section of the training. The antecedent, again, is the thing that sets the occasion for the behavior to occur. The behavior occurs, and then it's either strengthened or weakened by a reinforcer or a punisher. It is driven by the function, the purpose, and that is either to get attention, or to get materials or something they desire, or to escape a task demand, or for a sensory need. And that's all for now. Thank you.